Welcome. I'm James Calicut, Waterfowl and Upland Game Bird Extension Specialist.
I'm Mark McConnell, Assistant Professor of Upland Birds at Mississippi State University.
Dr. Brian Davis, Professor, Waterfowl and Wetlands Conservation.
The three of us are all biologists and hunters. Join us for discussions about game bird conservation and management and the science behind it. Of course, we'll also have conversations about bird dogs and bird hunting as well. This is Game Bird University. All right, y'all. Welcome. It's the Friday before Labor Day weekend, and so that marks the opening weekend of dove season, the first hunting opportunity of the season in Mississippi. So, what better topic to have this week than talking a little bit about doves? And we've invited my long-term friend and colleague, Houston Havens. He is the Waterfowl Program Coordinator for the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks, or MDWFP, as I'm sure we'll refer to it as. But even though he's the Waterfowl Program Coordinator, really his job responsibility covers all migratory game birds, so including doves. So we couldn't think of anybody better to have talk with us than Houston. Houston, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Try not to take it to heart that I'm not on the first episode, but appreciate you having me here.
We'll probably at least be the second episode.
No, we don't have to number them. We just release them all at once. Who knows? Yeah. We figured doves just wouldn't be the most popular bird people want to talk about, but somebody could argue they're the most pursued by the number of hunters.
It is very popular in Mississippi. It's hard to believe it's here again already. College football getting started, and is pretty synonymous with the opening weekend of dove season in Mississippi. So it's a really popular event.
That brings up a good point. I think of dove hunting is quite a bit different as far like Mark said, really popular. But dove hunting is the only thing I can think of that there are some people that dove hunt that are just hunt that opening weekend, and they're never going to hunt doves again for the rest of the season. Obviously, there's some dove hunters that hunt through the other two seasons segments, but the vast majority, I'm guessing probably over 90% or greater, and that's just my swag at that, but probably of dove hunting and dove harvest occurs in those first 3 days of the dove season. And so unlike duck hunting where if you had more days to the season, you're going to shoot more ducks and things like that. But with doves, you can add 10 days to a season. You probably won't have that many more dove shots. So it's a really odd, really different compared to other seasons where all that participation and harvest is just front-loaded to that one part. So it's kind of a unique season compared to other game bird seasons.
I was thinking this morning on the drive over just how the listener base of a podcast like this is probably a little more avid game bird hunters, probably your dove hunters that are hunting way more than the average. But you're right, the data year after year shows us that somewhere between 3 and 4 days is the average of a Mississippi dove hunter. That's the number of days they're going to hunt. And when we look at the band returns, it is extremely front-loaded, like James just said. 80 to 90% of our band returns are going to be those first 2 weekends. So it is really important. And you think about dove hunting, it's extremely social. We all have duck hunted together many times, and it's really social as well. But there's times when you have to be still, you have to be quiet. Dove hunting's really not like that. You can have kids, playing around in the woods behind you, or yelling at your buddy because he just missed, or he's got a bird coming that he doesn't see, and it doesn't really bother doves. And so the social aspect is kind of on the extreme end for dove hunting, I would say.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, as much as I look forward to it every year, it really depends on the weather. Like when it's miserably hot, it's almost work to go because you can't bring your dog, that kind of thing. But God, if the weather's ideal, that's a great way to spend the morning, especially if you're hunting in the morning. I got my first question because this is the question that I want to know more about, and I hear this question a lot. The whole resident or migratory question. Can you tell us in Mississippi what we know about the doves we're seeing opening day, and how that proportion is made up, if we know, and then if it changes throughout to the dove season? Most people don't hunt towards the end, but there's a lot of hunting days there.
Yep, they're 90-day season, most years, Mississippi, and so yeah, you're right. A lot of there are certainly some avid dove hunters that are hunting a large number of those days. Dove clubs and things like that.
Wait. There are dove clubs?
There are dove clubs, have land leased up, whether it's harvest agricultural fields, primarily in the Delta is where we hear from those. Have memberships, and they manage their hunts. They rotate their pressure around. Pretty organized.
I'll be damned. All right, sorry. Go ahead.
So, yeah.
The migratory part. Yeah.
Right.
Opening weekend.
Yeah. So
whose birds are we shooting?
Right. We're primarily shooting resident birds because those are the birds that are here when the season opens, of course, but also because of that hunting pressure being so front-loaded. The first 2 weekends when 80 to 90% of our hunting activity occurs, and so we certainly do get migratory doves that come to Mississippi by late winter, but you just think about there's so many other activities going on, hunting seasons going on, there's far fewer people that are out there harvesting doves at that time, and so we don't have a lot of band returns during the wintertime when we assume that we're getting migratory birds.
Because fewer people are hunting.
That's right, right. Just less of them being harvested and being reported from band returns. But certainly we are picking up birds. We know from communicating with other states in the Midwest that they're pretty much losing their doves, later in the winter. And so it stands to reason that they're coming south. And dove numbers will pick up. I'm sure, just like ducks on a cold front day, driving across a harvested dry ag field, sometimes you'll just see a lot of doves that you haven't been seeing a few days before, and kind of stands to reason that those birds just showed up. But one of the things we hear from hunters a lot is, they want to, especially an avid dove hunter wants to hunt later in the year because of those big migratory doves, and that certainly could be the case, but also it's just a plumage development of the doves. As they're preparing for winter, they're improving their body condition and getting ready to make it through the colder periods. So kind of an old wives' tale, I guess.
There's no shortage of those in the profession.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, so we're mostly in this latitude, mid-south. We're mostly killing our own birds that are born and raised here. Mm-hmm. Higher chance of killing a migratory bird if you're hunting later in the season, but still plenty of resident birds, around as well.
That's right.
I get that question all the time, and I always give them some version of that, but I wasn't always as sure of it.
So with our band returns of Mississippi marked birds that we see, of course they're primarily harvested in Mississippi, and then we kind of get a radiating effect pattern of birds that are at least a year past when they were banded. And so say birds we marked this summer, banded this summer, make it into next hunting, not this hunting season they're going into, but the next hunting season. Those are typically the birds that we will see being harvested in other states around us in the southeast. Yeah. So I guess all that to say is we're not losing many of our resident birds, traveling to other states. They're pretty well staying home, and then if they make it through this hunting season, they have a higher likelihood of travel.
But they are moving longitudinally a little bit.
That's right.
Man, that's pretty cool. I didn't know that either.
Yeah, and another piece, and I don't know how much truth to this, is I've never really pursued doves that much past in those later seasons, but I know a lot of hunters, when I was working with you at the state, when people would want to call and want to make sure we're having that late season opportunity, that December time frame, great opportunity, duck hunt in the morning, duck hunt in the afternoon type thing. They really would speak a lot of like these birds are in big flocks. It's not these singles coming to a field. It's like we're shooting into flocks and that sort of thing. So I don't know. Like I said, I've never pursued them during that time, so I don't know if that's really true or not. If that behavior changed.
Yeah, I think it is. And biologically, I couldn't give you a reason for that. I would say that I've observed that, and I guess my assumption has been that food is a little more limiting that time, and so birds are kind of gathering up, and where there is decent food resources late winter, then they're really concentrated on those areas. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think about going on an afternoon deer hunt and going through a field and getting up just really big wads of doves in certain places of fields. They're probably keying in on some weed seeds that were left over in that ag field, late producing things like that.
So y'all think they're getting more gregarious as food becomes more limited?
I think so, yeah, and that's just my
interesting
kind of an
well, I was thinking,
one hypothesis.
Well, yeah, I was thinking that could be it too. Then I was curious, like about predator pressure. Like, do they become more gregarious during, say, peaks of hawk migration. Or we see like quail obviously become gregarious for a bunch of reasons, thermoregulation, vigilance, but a lot of it, they're getting a tremendous amount of avian predation during hawk migration through winter. So I was just curious if that had anything to do with it.
Yeah.
There hasn't just been a ton of research on doves over the years.
There really hasn't, no. And just thinking about, the behaviors of different bird species. I know we're not talking waterfowl today, we're not talking ducks, but
don't you dare.
Pretty different for ducks, moving into late season. They're, getting less gregarious, breaking off into those pronouns and all. So, yeah.
But doves are breeding damn near year round.
That's right.
In this latitude, right?
Yep. Yep. Pulling off multiple clutches a year.
Yeah. Yeah, I know I have encountered dove nests. I've encountered dove nests on the ground a lot in the prairie.
Yeah.
Where we were like nest dragging for like sparrows and stuff. And dove gets up and there's eggs right there. But I've seen that in a lot of different months. I remember on LSU campus when I was an undergrad, I think I found a nest in a tree in November. But of course it was Baton Rouge. It was 90 degrees.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, plenty of opportunity to pull off a clutch.
All right, Houston. So all the dove field management stuff that people talk about, it seems like everyone come say April, May, people are getting revved up trying to get their dove plots in. It seems the most popular thing is sunflowers, sure, and then maybe a little brown top, and then there's various millets besides brown top people can plant. My first question is, in your experience in the Mid-South, what do you see people having the most success with? And then I have a separate follow-up about return on investment that's going to get us in the weeds. No pun intended.
That second one's going to be a tough one. Certainly the most effective, when you can do it right, when you can actually pull off a crop, is planting sunflowers and growing them out to maturity. That involves mid-April to about May 1st, generally the cutoff if you're managing for a mature crop by Labor Day weekend, typically in Mississippi. And so when you're able to do that and do it well, and that means everything from managing your weeds all the way through, and then the deer pressure, which I did not personally do well this year at all, and so we had total failure on deer white sunflower.
They're hitting it when it goes in the milk stage, or what are they?
They're hitting it from emergence, and then
time.
coming back again if any are left by the milk stage as well.
I ran into that when I was at UGA. You couldn't get a dove field in certain parts of the state without a 2-strand staggered high tape fence.
Absolutely.
And that seemed to work really well. The deer definitely didn't seem to be able to figure that out. But the comparisons I saw were like you said, crop failure to legitimate crop.
Yeah.
And I had not experienced deer pressure like that back when I was working on a farm and we had dove fields. But my goodness, man, that is an underappreciated challenge.
Certainly is. But the good thing is, like you mentioned, some of the other things like millet, brown top especially, the later time period there for the planting gives you some options if you have, extensive deer damage in sunflowers or something you planted earlier like corn or milo to come in with brown top millet and still be able to grow that to mature seed and be able to manage that as well. So lots of flexibility built in the time frame.
Is it brown top, so it's like 60 days to mature? Yeah. So yeah.
And like I said, it's a lot of. You can broadcast some sunflowers. Bill showed me a picture of the day. He broadcasts them hardly great. A lot of people drill them, but brown top, it's just so easy to put out. Seed's cheaper. It's covering more of the ground, so the pre-emerge is still important, but it's not maybe as critical. I see a lot of people do sunflowers and they want to save money, and I say if you're going to do a sunflower field, you're not going to save money. If you want to do it right, just pay for the pre-emerge. Do it right. The amount of money, I don't know, $400-ish an acre if you're doing everything correctly. Just be prepared to do it if you want to have a good stand. And every time I see some people get away with it, absolutely. But I see more failure than not.
Right. And so you talk about seeing people getting away with it. You can certainly grow a sunflower crop, with a little less input, but that weed control is not necessarily just for producing sunflower seeds.
Huntability.
For huntability, for having that seed on clean ground once you go in and mow it or manage it otherwise. And so, I'm sure most people listening know that doves prefer clean ground, but it can't be overstated that it needs to be clean seed on top of ground that they can just go and find really easily. They're not going to scratch around like turkeys. They're not going to dig for anything that's covered up, and so it's really important to be able to have that. You don't want to have a grass thatch underneath your sunflowers.
That's a really good point. Yeah, it may look good from the picture, but on the ground where the dove are, it's going to be hard. And like I said, when you go stripping it, your bush hogs. If you got a bunch of grass, your bush hog is going to leave 6 to 8 inches of grass.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And it doesn't take much for them to get to a point where they can't really scratch through it or don't want to scratch through it. Because, I mean, they are super poor.
Oh, yeah, their
Scratchers.
feet. You compare their feet to like even a duck's, but you compare their feet to like a quail. I mean, the whole structure is different. They're not designed to scratch. Yeah.
And so if you get into a situation like that, it's still not all is lost. You can go in and disc some bare ground strips in between, to attract birds, and then they can kind of filter out as well. Another thing we see people do a lot of times is if they have, didn't manage their weeds very well and they go in and mow sunflowers or corn, they'll go in and follow up with an herbicide, just kill everything that's there, and then try to burn it off. Yeah, of course, especially late August, early September in Mississippi, you want to pay attention to burn bans, things like that. You want to have a fire lane disc
Look,
around.
I burned last Sunday in Clay County, and the burn ban started the next day in Clay County. I was right under the wire.
Yeah. But if you're able to and the conditions permit, running a fire through, some dead grass and just cleaning it up to, again, expose those seeds on top of the ground can be really effective.
So a sunflower seed, on an average fire like that, it's probably not going to consume that seed, big hard seed like that.
That's a good question. I haven't seen that.
I don't think it would, but I think small grass seeds, surely they're going to get consumed.
Sure.
Right, I would think. All right, so
I don't know if there's a lot of literature.
I don't think
out
there
there
is.
on
Like I
that.
said, there's a lot we just don't know about it.
Houston, was there some, of course, I'm just thinking of the size of the seed and, of course, quite a bit of difference between these two, but, you did a lot of your master's work and everything around post-harvest practices of rice, as far as with ducks now, but, burning was one of those practices. Was there any information in some of the literature that you looked at for that as far as, if that seed was still...
They'd do
they'd still be able
to bring this back to ducks.
That's right. It always comes back to ducks.
It does. I mean, let's face it.
So no, that was an assumption that we made. But we did not test that. It kind of stand to reason. Running a fire through all that rice straw might kill the germ in the rice seed and cause it to be available for longer. It certainly removed
germination
the
from and then the thatch.
Yeah, certainly made it more visible and more accessible to birds. But yeah, it's an interesting hypothesis that it could potentially make seeds even last longer by burning if they're not consumed by the fire.
Yeah. And so, what would you say of the dove fields you're aware of in Mississippi? The people that are doing it to shoot on an open weekend, proportion-wise, sunflowers versus some kind of millet, with brown top being obviously. I don't know. I've seen some that are like 8 foot high. That can't be brown top. Just driving down the road. I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Egyptian
wheat. I don't know.
Yeah.
It blew my mind. I don't know how they're going to hunt over. They're going to choke down their bush hog and break the gearbox.
Right. Yeah, I mean, sunflowers are really popular. This was a really tough year for sunflower fields, just being wet to start off, people getting behind and then just turning off extremely dry, and then, adding the deer situation in some areas as well. But yeah, I would say sunflowers are the most popular. And then, of course, you have the late season preparation where people are going to go out and plant wheat for deer food plots, multi-purpose, and dove hunt over those as well. And so that August 15th to October 15th planting date window for winter wheat works out well for dove season as well.
Well, it's good timing. I was just reminding myself a note to talk about the baiting regs. So
I'm getting Houston nervous here. He's not a sworn officer.
That's right. Yeah.
That's his caveat. His caveat.
So those just for the people who are curious, because I get asked this all the time, and I try to. What I tell people is whatever is a standard agricultural practice, and that by each state is set by the Extension Service or that their land grant university. So if for the conditions in which they say you can spread wheat at a certain rate under a certain type of seedbed. Mm-hmm. So you're saying it's August 15th to October 15th. Yeah. What's that in reference to for people that aren't that window of time?
That's the planting dates from Mississippi State Extension Service
for winter
wheat. That's right.
So it has to be a prepared seedbed.
That's what we recommend. And again, it always goes back to it needs to be a legitimate attempt to plant wheat. It's not, when we get questions about, hey, I want to put out wheat for dove hunting, that's not the right frame of mind to be started with. If you're going out to plant wheat, by spreading 90 to 100 pounds per acre, evenly distributed, And
No
typically-
piles.
Right, no piles. That wheat's going to need some soil contact to germinate properly, and so a prepared seed bed is what we do recommend.
No sweetening the pot. Don't go back and
Yeah, my
redistribute.
understanding is once you put out whatever the recommended seeding rate is, and so I saw it, but a couple years ago, they put everything out, they got a ton of rain, and all their wheat germinated, dove season was coming up, they dissed under it again, and then reapplied. And I was
Right.
like, that is not standard
Right.
agricultural practice, because
That's right.
if you're trying to grow wheat, you're growing wheat.
Right.
You can't
Would
stop
not-
the wheat growth.
Yeah.
You would not, under normal agricultural purposes, you would not
Till the
diss under
successfully
standard
germinated
wheat. That's
field.
correct. Right.
Yeah.
It
And
didn't feel
so
like
what-
it was good enough.
It's not good enough.
It wasn't growing good
We
enough.
can do better.
We can do better.
And so what happens, if an officer visits that field, it's really easy to tell,
Yeah.
when that happens, if you've got, sprouted wheat that's, several inches tall, because you're not going to get it all with the disc when you do that. And then the fresh wheat on top of the ground is,
Yeah.
it's pretty easy to
I
decide.
had a buddy of mine, say buddy, a guy I knew years ago got busted not too far from here, and the next day he had asked me to come out and look at his field and give him an opinion on whether it was baited or not. And I said, it doesn't matter what I see. At first, I'm not the arbiter of that anyway. The game warden, there's federal game wardens that got them. I said, it's their decision. I said, but I can go and tell you, no matter what I see, it doesn't matter. It's how you prepared it.
Mhm.
The conditions that hunting over is, to my knowledge, is less irrelevant than how they got there. So what happened with him was they had, I think 3 or 4 times he had gone and resalted the field a little bit,
Mhm.
and they had him on camera.
So you just mentioned something that came to mind. Talking with law enforcement officers, whether it's state or federal, typically questions that they'll ask when they're going through a dove field, talking with hunters, and they're doing the interviews. And this really applies to if you're going hunting with somebody else. If you didn't prepare the field yourself, we're typically going to ask, do you know how it was prepared? Did you ask, and did you look yourself? And so you need to be able to answer all of those if
yeah,
you're going hunting with
negligence is no
somebody else.
excuse.
That's right. Walk through the field, especially if you're getting there before daylight. Get out there and look and do your homework on the front end before you get in a situation there.
Yeah. I didn't mean to get us off on baiting.
No.
I know it's a question I get a lot, so it's more from my own knowledge.
And real quick before we leave baiting and switch off to some other topics, one thing that's a little different for doves is the manipulation part. Being able to
Right.
manipulate the planted crops you have. That is,
Right.
allowed for doves.
Oh, you mean because you can't do that?
You can't do that for waterfowl.
Yeah.
I hate to bring up ducks. But that's always a confusion
That's
for
a good
people who hunt
comparison.
both.
Right.
Like I can't, I can't manipulate it if I'm duck hunting over
That's
here,
right.
but can for dove hunting.
That's right. Yeah. And so that we always talking with people who are thinking ahead and planning in the spring for what they're going to do. We always recommend doing some type of crop planting that they're going to grow to maturity and then go in and mow or disc and manipulate. We do get questions about what about managing a dove field early, and then I'm going to be duck hunting, if it floods later on. And so we definitely tell people they need to plan those areas out ahead of time. We don't recommend manipulating a dove field that's going to eventually
Yeah.
be flooding, just to stay out of that area.
We saw that the Delta one time on those catfish ponds
Yep.
across in the main group. I remember that they had a dove field out there in one of the ponds. I remember thinking like, oh, we won't be hunting. Or you told me
Yeah.
we can't hunt this
Right.
because they had mowed through strips of it.
Sure.
That's the first time I remember hearing about that. Man.
Yeah, and there's there's ways to mitigate for that if you're just doing it for an opening weekend dove hunt, and then if you disc it under really good and get some moisture in the ground, you might get rid of that seed, germinate and all, but it's it's risky at that point.
Yeah.
You could have some strips unplanted that you maybe come through and disc between the plantings or something, so you got some bare ground and have that standing vegetation between it, and then
Sure.
that would be perfectly fine.
That's right.
And then you'd have kind of some recently set back succession, or
Yeah.
open area to create that interspersion of some of that
Right.
standing crop and open water for the ducks too.
He's
Yeah.
desperately trying not to say Hemi Marsh right now. I can hear it.
And so all this discussion brings up a good point that our state agency has biologists that can come out on the front end. It's always best to ask these questions and get a plan on the front end, so you can stay out of these situations. Because once something is done and you've messed up, your potential for, dove hunting early and duck hunting later in the season or whatever the case may be. We have private lands biologists, wildfowl biologists that can come out and take a look and kind of put together a game plan for private landowners before they start.
Is there anything else a landowner can do around their fields to benefit their hunt, or just, we don't, I know Doug, we talked a little bit about dove numbers. They're somewhat in a decline based off some of the broader surveys.
That's right.
We can get into that, I guess, more if we need to. I don't generally think of doves as something I'm worried about because I always seem to see so many, but maybe that's a separate discussion next. Is there anything else landowners can do to enhance outside of the field itself? Is there anything they can do to enhance their experience while harvesting doves? There
is. James and I actually co-authored an article in Mississippi Outdoors recently this summer, and
oh crap! Sorry.
talking about some of these issues as well. Just managing natural grasses is a really good way. Think about late August into early September. Things are drying down. Grasses have produced quite a bit of seed. Pasture settings, turn row settings, things like that. And so, if those are dried down and starting to senesce by themselves already, just going in and mowing, putting that seed onto the ground is a good way to do that. Some other areas you may need to do some spraying, some herbicide applications to be able to dry those down, and again, running a fire through it if it's safe and the conditions allow, to be able to just clean it up and leave that seed behind. Another thing that we see done on areas that are intensively managed for dove hunting, and I'm talking about areas that are going to be a dove field year after year, is injection on trees, a tree line around, just making dead snags. That's right. Doves really love just a clean, dead limb to land on. We've all probably seen that on the edges of fields before. And so just providing that around right where your food source is going to be, an easy place for doves when it gets hot like it's going to be in the early September days in Mississippi, for those doves to go to and rest. And then another thing is just having a water source nearby. That's not necessarily something that you can really just go out and add, but if you have lakes or cattle ponds, nearby, managing a clean bank right next to that water that doves can land on, go right down and get a water source.
I've weeded it around banks before, just to, down to the dirt. Just
that's
so
right. Yep. Weed eating, run a disc down beside it, or just spraying the vegetation that's there, and keeping a clean bank can really add some benefit as well.
I used to, in Louisiana years ago, people were talking about having some phony power lines, just stringing up some wire and posts across their field just to have them light on it.
My dad did that last year on ours.
Did it work?
It does. It
does. Oh, that's awesome. Can we ask what you used to make that?
He just took some old metal poles, strung them up, and then I don't remember what kind of wire he used, but it's pretty thick diameter wire, and stretched it between about 4 poles. This is a 3-acre field, so not a really large area, but absolutely works.
Dang.
That's a really good idea.
I think. Go ahead.
Yeah, my uncle tried to do something similar to that one time. Were you there on that hunt? It's like me and Heath and some folks traveled back to New Albany to do that. Well,
I wasn't invited on that one.
Oh, well.
Sounds like everybody else was.
Forgive me. I only invite you on the ones I know are going to be
quality.
Yeah. No, I only invite you on the ones I think have potential for quality, because I don't want to hear you complaining about it when it's not. And this was definitely not one we were sure it was going to be quality, but we had some things set up out there, as perches and such. Yeah. Of course, we didn't have any doves, so I couldn't tell you if that worked or not. Yeah. But it's good to hear that idea does work.
Yeah, it does work.
Dang, that's good to know.
Well, kind of speaking to the, things around the dove field, key landscape kind of components, that's something else that we don't really know a whole lot about. Right. About what landscape makeup, you're going to decide where to put a dove field. Should you put a dove field? Or should you put a dove field? Because there's probably some landscapes that don't have a lot of dove-friendly places around it, and if you put one in there, you may not get that many doves because there's not a lot of other source of habitat around it for those birds to even be around that area. So
Absolutely.
that's something that, just really don't know a whole lot about. And to Mark's comment earlier too about doves being in this the eastern management unit, the eastern part of the U.S., kind of being somewhat on the decline, but not too substantially so that these wild fluctuations we may have, and dove hunting success. Is that a result of population, or is that a result of landscapes that fields are in, or
Right.
things that are happening in the land use, or the thing, other things, crop harvest, stuff like that that's
Yeah.
going on.
We hear from people all the time say, "Man, I managed a great quality food source, and we just didn't have the birds," and it's always a head scratcher. But typically, just like you said, people are they're just thinking about their property lines. Like, my property is really managed, but they're not, thinking about the landscape and how conducive that may or may not be for, holding doves.
Seems like, if I remember from the way Elmore's work, seems like having some ag helps.
Sure.
Yeah.
Definitely going to have more in that situation, but there's probably a point where you can overdo that. Having obviously since they can nest on the ground and up in, that, I think just having a diverse landscape, a lot of different land cover types is probably better than having solid bottomland or just solid pasture the whole way. But yeah, we don't know a lot about it, and so the project that y'all are funding, that Calicut and I are working on with my postdoc Akil, is aimed to look at some of that in the landscape context. But it's also aimed at a very specific question that Calicut and I have been talking about since we've probably known each other. I hear it every year, but we don't know, and I want to emphasize, we don't know the answer. That's why we're investigating it. But you hear a lot of people in areas where there's dove fields and there's active year after year dove hunting, some consistency and effort will say that they got a lot of birds up leading in their field that they managed well leading up to the season, and then everybody starts cutting corn in that county.
Yes.
And then opening day, the amount of birds they have been seeing in the field versus what they harvest is not what they expected by a long shot.
Yes.
And then so when I was,
Most of those people commenting on that have not identified the crop that was harvested leading up to that, though.
Sure.
It's kind of more like what happened.
Yeah. Well, like I said, you can see if you start to see a lot of combines on the ground, but to the extent of that, we don't know. When I was growing up, it was like, man, if it's a really, really wet going into the dove season, you're happy because no one's cutting corn yet. So the best food on the landscape is your field if you manage it right. But if it's dry like this year where there's nothing stopping people from cutting corn, like at all, in fact, they may be cutting corn early,
Absolutely.
then does that have an impact on local dove harvest? So we're trying to look at that. And I was talking with a landowner the other day, in his mid-80s, been around a while. He said, absolutely not. He doesn't think it has anything to do with it because the combines have gotten so efficient. He said, when you walk out into a cornfield after harvest, there's very little corn left on the ground.
Yeah.
Now, we know that's gotten better over time,
Yes.
right? To the extent it's gotten better, I don't know if I have a number on it. So just let's pick your brain about
There's a
that.
lot more to that, too, to that point, like depending on where they are and harvesting it. If you're, they may not be leaving a lot, but if everybody is really cutting, there's some waste grain out there that still has that potential, to spread those birds out.
And think about, they don't necessarily have to be eating corn in those harvested fields, right?
That's
They
true,
could be
that's
getting, tons of other grass seeds.
That are
and
just
things.
under the corn.
That's
Yeah,
right.
so
They
now
were not
bare ground.
available
Yeah.
until that corn was cut, and now they.
Are
they
you
have
trying to
access.
say grassy corn? Is this what you're trying to do here?
That's right.
I feel like I'm
We're
just
trying to steer it right
two
back
duck
to ducks.
guys just constantly trying to wiggle it in there.
It's just natural. It happens.
It's just so much more fascinating.
Oh my God. But yeah, so do you hear that from hunters, or do you?
Heard it just this week, actually. Yes, had birds on my managed dove field, and then the next day I went out there to look and had 50% or some crazy amount of reduction. Birds just left, and we've, just like you said, we've always hypothesized that that's something that could be happening. And then the other thing is just weather changes. We know that they're a migratory bird, even though these are resident birds. Most of them are here this early in the season. They still move with weather changes. Things happening that are just kind of shuffling things this time of year. Get a cool north breeze like we kind of had last week.
Man, that was nice.
Moving through, and
I've never burned in August with a north wind, but it was fun.
I bet.
Yeah,
I bet.
it was refreshing. Well, I think what it calls into question, Houston, and we've talked, all three of us have talked about this. It'd be really cool to get some really nice satellite or GPS transmitters on some doves
Yeah.
and kind of look at some of that. Look at the effect of what happens when a field gets on opening day. How far do they go? Do they not come back after a while if they got shot to hell, the day before, or just those movements with weather? That's one of those things. And there's not really a direct maybe management implication to it, but I think, or there might be, but what I think would help a lot of hunters is just to validate or not validate some questions, hypotheses we have, so you can manage expectations.
Right.
So like, I'll give you an example. We did and I'll give a duck example this time. Yeah, so I'm contradicting myself.
Proud of it.
Yeah, I was doing ringneck duck research in the Red Hills several years ago, and it was a common accepted dogma that when the birds got off the duck ponds in the morning, they flew one direction, which happened to be towards the coast. And most of the people we talked to there were adamant that they were going to roost and spend the rest of the day on the coast. And I was like, man, ringnecks on the coast. I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I knew the answer was no, but you didn't want to, whatever. But they were adamant about it. So we had these fancy $2,500 transmitters. We tagged 60-something ringnecks a year, which is not a huge sample based on the population, but not that small of a sample for a duck study. And lo and behold, not a single duck ever went to the coast. In fact, most of them didn't really get that close. And it was one of those things where people just perceived it.
Sure.
I can remember one guy telling me, I know what's between here and there, and the only thing they could be going is to the coast. Right? So I think there's so we got that data, and we were like, hey, okay, they're not going to the coast. What they're doing is they're going to your neighbor's property, who also has a duck call that wasn't getting hunted that day, and they were getting away from pressure is what we kind of deduced they were probably doing. So do we know if doves even respond to pressure like that? Because it's so punctuated.
Right. Don't know. But yeah, you're exactly right. The way that we try to answer those questions when somebody calls and said, hey, my dove's left, we just offer possible explanations. But you're right, we don't have the information to know
I
for
would
sure.
love to know where they're going and how far they're going, if they're really going, or if the observations are just so periodic that they're just not capturing the trend.
Right.
That's a huge issue we deal with wildlife observations. They're not consistently spaced across time to make a perfect.
Yeah. Just the day they happen to be there and the time of day and all that.
So I'll give you another scenario, kind of taking that a little further that we hear and I've personally seen before, is kind of the other way around, where maybe you didn't have birds and then can't explain it, but the next morning went out and hunted and they were there, showed up. Were those birds that you had earlier, or did they just show up from somewhere else? Did they move in from a completely different area? We don't know that as well, but it certainly happens that way as well. That's what I'm hoping happens on my.
Well, it makes me think, as you were saying that, I'm thinking like, man, with as fancy as the game cameras have gotten now, where everybody's just got them on their phone and you just see people looking, I wonder, you don't think of them going on dove fields very often, or at least I never have, but it makes you wonder if, what a more systematic way to evaluate use if you could put it in a way where you could capture doves coming or going, to get away from that, just like we were talking in the last episode, and I'll pick on deer hunters for this, but turkey hunters do it too. And duck hunters do it, but they spend 2 mornings a week on a deer stand and interpret all deer movement behavior.
Right.
This is before the cameras became more popular, but for years, I had guys tell me, those deer don't move except on this day. I'm like, well, but the other 5 days of the week, you weren't on the property, so you have no way of knowing if that deer moved or not, right? Yeah. So like with doves, I think there's just a lot of things we just, like I said, we just don't know that I think research could help us. Yeah. It'd be really fun to study some of that.
Exactly, because that's the thing. You hunt early in the morning, you hunt like mid-afternoon or whatever, and that's just the way it's always been done. And kind of the same thing. I hate to go back to ducks again.
That's all right. I did it once.
But a lot of times, duck hunting is always just mostly a morning thing. Plenty of people that hunt in the afternoon, but there's a lot of folks that are kind of first to afternoon hunting because
let them rest.
Yeah, let them rest. And so I get that question like, I got this place ducks are coming into, but they're only coming in there in the afternoon. Can I, how do I turn that into a morning spot? Just the thing. In some places, that's where birds, based on the bird, and we don't know enough about dove movements and that sort of thing to really, give any suggestion for changing when you use the field or not. And most people don't have that level of observational information on a regular basis to know, well, maybe you got doves coming in at 10 o'clock in the morning to your field and they're leaving out by 1 and you just totally missed
it. Yeah. All right, I got one last topic I'm curious about, is their diet. Because we talked about this a couple years ago when we were talking about fooling around with some of this. There hasn't really been a really robust assessment of dove diet in a while. Maybe dove diets haven't changed, and maybe there's no reason to. But to the extent of your knowledge, walk us through. We know they'll eat sunflowers when they're there, but before we were planting sunflower, or when we're not sunflowers, what are these doves eating all year long?
Small grass seeds
Small grass
is a
seeds.
really high component of their diet. You know, we've all seen it. You know, when we're harvesting doves, going back planting them. You know, you may have been hunting on a cornfield or sunflower field, or you know, a freshly planted wheat field. You'll find some birds that have some of that in it, but probably the majority of them have natural seeds in their crop. You know, that's the main source of what they're feeding on, and so it really is as simple as a seed source that they can easily access on that clean ground. And that's why we always try to stress that, is it's not just having an abundance of, you know, certain type of seeds, sunflowers, corn, whatever it may be. It's really that accessibility of that, you know, how easily they can get it, find it, and efficiently feed on it.
And grass seeds, just as a broad categorization, are promoted through disturbance.
Absolutely, that's
So
right.
that we're going back to.
Or at least-
Hopefully, in every episode, we're going to touch on several themes: fire, disturbance, you know, manipulating things to manage these species. But I feel like dove. When I was in Georgia, I used to give these game bird workshops. I had a section on dove management. I was, man, there's just nothing in the literature about just managing for dove, really, outside of your field prep. And I was like, why don't we know more about this? Probably because we took them for granted, like we've done with many species. Doves are doing fine for a really long time, and most people only hunt them 2-3 days, like you said.
Right.
So it's not as much of an issue, and they seem to be a natural byproduct. What we used to say about quail, a natural byproduct of what we're doing. But I wonder if that's going to be the case forever. You know, promoting prescribed fire at the appropriate scale and timing to benefit dove food and dove structure availability, like you're saying, get them access to the seeds is something we just haven't focused on because we haven't had to.
Sure. It would also be interesting, just an updated diet study from the standpoint of, like we talked about earlier, with in ag systems, you know, with the efficiency of, you know, all this new machinery that's not leaving a whole lot in these ag fields anymore.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure that's gotten worse and worse, you know, as time goes on. The last time we looked at how much food's available in those, you know, 20 something years ago. So.
I think I sent you a meme the other day, or Instagram reel, and it was talking about normal agricultural practice, and it shows a guy harvesting corn on his combine, and apparently he just like slams the brakes, and all the corn in the bin just piles it, and he just keeps on going. And I was like, yeah, that's a case where there's plenty of food on the ground.
Sure.
But I remember when I was an undergrad, they were talking, the Louisiana Wildlife, I think, Society meeting, I guess it was, they were talking then, it was Sam King, I think he was doing some of it. They were talking about like rice waste grain just getting less and less and less even back then. Surely the technology's got even more efficient,
Right.
and you can harvest so much faster now than you could 30 years ago. So you're getting, not that it matters here because the ducks aren't coming down anyway, but you're getting fields cleared out, you know, in the fraction of the time it probably took 30 years ago.
Right.
And then all that stuff's just sitting there by the time the duck gets there. You know.
Yeah. And harvesting it earlier as well.
I know earlier, yeah.
Earlier, yeah. I was going to say that timing of harvest has shifted. I mean, probably even just a decade or so ago. I mean, you weren't seeing corn getting harvested quite as early as you're seeing some of it now.
That's a good point.
Probably some planters running into February.
And what's interesting is, down here we're doing that because we can't leave corn standing. You get up a little farther in latitude,
Right.
they can just leave it,
Mm-hmm.
right? We can't do that. But you and I were you had pulled the NAS, the National Ag Statistics Service data on the timing of corn harvest, and it varied, but we couldn't go back far enough. But you know, some years it looks like about 60%. Correct me if I'm wrong. About 60% of the corn was harvested by opening day of dove season.
Mm-hmm.
Some years maybe it was 40, maybe some years it was 80. What we're trying to figure out, I guess, in that study is, does that shift? Is it enough? Because a lot of times we say, well, that's not enough to matter. We have no idea how birds respond to those kinds of changes.
Yeah.
That's like you said, 20% in a county that's got 40,000 acres of corn. That's a lot
more bare ground that suddenly just appeared, and maybe it's a little bit more influential as far as with food resources. There's probably a certain period during that harvest time, percentage of harvest, you haven't gotten to the point where people are finishing up all their acres and coming back and doing post-harvest.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
And so, which would then make that food less available. But either way, still though, that's a lot more bare ground with potential for seeds, like Houston was saying earlier. Even if you had a fair amount of that had been disked back under or hipped up or whatever. Mm-hmm. But yeah, somewhere in that 40% to 100 or somewhere before 100, you hit 100% harvest. There's got to be a lot of it where it's just harvested and nobody's gone back and done any other entries into the field, and so that waste grain is potentially still available.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. We do seem to see more people running a disc right behind the combine than at least I saw when I was working on a farm. Right. Yeah, I wish they weren't, but
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
ducks and everybody's.
But crop consultants tell me that they say I've talked to several farmers and consultants, and they tell me they're concerned about field prep in the spring, mm-hmm. so they go ahead and do it now. Sure. Some of them will go ahead and hip it now. Now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because all the rainfall you're going to get, it's not going to be a true hipped up row the way you want it by the time you go and plant. You're probably going to have to hip it again, because it's just the rain's going to knock it down. But it seems I see more and more more and more discs behind the combine every year.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Just doing everything they can to be ahead for the next year. Can't blame them.
Well, we're probably getting close to running out of time here, but we'll cover one more quick thing that I think is important before we leave out. Is y'all do a lot of dove banding? That's what we've been talking about. A lot of some of this information we get, and that's really good information for y'all and Fish and Wildlife Service and others. As far as getting estimates of harvest and population size, all that sort of thing. Yeah. So, and it's a little different, again, not to mention ducks again, but ducks, it's a lot easier to tell when you got to harvest.
Excessive.
It is. I'm just doing it purely to irritate
it's like the 11th time.
Yeah. You can see a duck band a lot easier.
Yes.
Dove hunters really probably ought to, when they're cleaning birds, check those legs real well, because they can be up against, where the feathers, meet the leg there, and I can get hidden by those feathers over the top of it. Yep. And so really check those things, because they're not as easy to pick up. So don't miss reporting those bands.
And if your eyes are getting bad like mine, you may need a pair of eyeglasses to be able to read the band number as well.
Yeah, it's a little bit smaller.
There's tiny dove bands, right? But yeah, that's a good point. They're not as conspicuous. They don't really stand out just because of the size of the band. But yeah, definitely pay attention to those when they're going through your birds to clean.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully we're all going to have a good weekend this weekend.
I wouldn't get your hopes up, but
I know.
It's really an experiment. Yeah.
I understand. Well, I don't ever get my hopes up when I go out.
I'll walk right into that.
But anyway, well, Houston, thank you so much for coming and joining the conversation today. I know we're going to have you back on, if you'll come back after that.
Absolutely. Enjoyed it.
He didn't get harassed. You did.
I know. Well, I'm used to it. So, but we'll have you back on and talk ducks the next time, so it'll be a much better conversation.
I doubt I'll be here for that.
Nah. You can talk to Brian and I on that. Yeah. Anyway, appreciate you, Houston.
Thank y'all.
Thanks for joining us on Gamebird University Podcast. To keep up to date on when new episodes are dropped, or for more information on gamebirds and their management, you can follow us on Instagram at MSUEXT_gamebird, or follow us on Facebook at MSU Extension Gamebird Program.